When you live out on the edge of town, you expect a certain amount of peace. That's why I bought my land in the first place. 20 quiet acres just outside the city limits. It wasn't flashy land, not the kind you brag about at a country club. It was the kind of land you worked on, sweated on, raised a family on. For me, it was survival land. My grandparents called it the insurance plan. Crops, livestock, clean well water. It was everything we needed to stay self-sufficient if the world ever went sideways. But nothing in my plans included an HOA. See, technically, part of my land bordered a neighborhood. A fancy HOA neighborhood full of zero-lot line homes with postage stamp yards and rules about curtain colors. When I bought my acreage 15 years ago, that neighborhood hadn't even existed. It showed up later, creeping outward like suburban ivy, swallowing up pasture land with plastic fences and mandatory holiday decorations. At first, I thought nothing of it. I wasn't part of their HOA. My land was grandfathered in, zone agricultural. I had every legal right to plant, grow, and harvest whatever I wanted. I kept to myself. Put up extra fencing to keep their dogs off my property. Installed cameras when their kids got brave with my gates. I didn't complain when they built their playground facing my barns. I figured we could coexist. That changed the year I expanded my crops. The world had been on shaky ground for a while. Supply chains failing. Grocery stores running short on basics. Prices skyrocketing. My wife and I decided it was time to scale up. We converted 4 extra acres into food production. Sweet corn, squash, beans, potatoes. Enough not just for ourselves, but for trade, barter, maybe even local distribution if things got worse. We invested in proper irrigation, good soil amendments, fencing to keep the deer at bay. It was about the time the seedlings broke ground that the first HOA notice appeared on my fence post. Unauthorized agricultural development in a residential vicinity. I laughed, out loud, showed it to my wife. They think they run this side of the fence too. We ignored it. Then came the letterhead. Formal complaints from the HOA board, signed by their president, Linda Parson. Middle-aged, visor-wearing, clipboard-carrying suburban royalty. She claimed my crops were an eyesore, that they attracted pests, that I was creating a potential health hazard for the neighborhood children. I sent her a copy of my deed. Agricultural exemption. County zoning maps highlighted in bright yellow. I underlined the words, not subject to HOA jurisdiction. 2 weeks later, they escalated. A code enforcement officer showed up. Not the county's. The HOA's private contractor. I met him at the gate with a coffee in hand and reminded him that he was trespassing. He backed down fast. I figured that would be the end of it. Then the sabotage started. Sprinklers shut off mysteriously. Rows of seedlings trampled overnight. Pesticide mysteriously spilled across my irrigation lines. I installed more cameras. Footage didn't lie. HOA board members after dark, slipping through my side gate like raccoons. I reported it to the sheriff. He said it was civil, not criminal. Told me to take it up with the HOA. So I did. I showed up at their next meeting. Boots dirty, sun hat in hand, folder of evidence under my arm. I wasn't there to pick a fight. I was there to end one. Linda barely let me speak. Claimed I was causing unrest and creating a hostile environment for the community. She tried to cut me off, but I dropped the folder on the table. Photos, timestamps, trespass logs, footage screenshots. Her signature on 2 of the complaint letters. Her face on my cameras at 11:47 p.m., climbing over my fence with a garden rake. The room got real quiet after that. Her defense? We were merely inspecting suspected violations. I walked out that night, thinking the worst was behind me. I underestimated just how far desperate suburban tyrants will go to keep their illusion of control intact. 3 days later, I woke up to the sound of heavy machinery. Bulldozers. On my land. They'd hired a crew, private, not county. Came in through the back utility easement, tearing through fencing like it wasn't even there. Flattened half an acre before I got down there. Rows of young corn, destroyed. Topsoil scraped into useless mounds. Irrigation shredded. I flagged down the crew boss, demanded paperwork. He handed me a permit signed by the HOA president herself. Some fabricated emergency access road easement they'd conjured up overnight. A permit with no legal standing on my side of the fence. But try explaining that to a man driving a cat at 6 a.m. By the time the sheriff arrived, the damage was done. Civil matter, he said again, shaking his head. You'll have to sue them. I filed suit the next day. Cease and desist. Property damage. Harassment. Trespassing. But that wasn't the end. Not even close. Because while Linda and her HOA clapped themselves on the back for reclaiming land they had no right to touch, something bigger was brewing. That same week, a federal notice hit our county offices. Supply chain crisis. Infrastructure vulnerabilities. FEMA intervention protocols triggered for the state. Agricultural assets, especially those designated as local food sources, were now protected under federal emergency guidelines. And wouldn't you know it, my freshly bulldozed acreage was listed, registered, protected. When FEMA showed up to assess the situation, the HOA's little stunt became something much, much bigger. And Linda? Well, panic doesn't begin to cover it. When FEMA steps onto your property, it changes everything. The man who showed up at my gate wasn't some HOA security guard or clipboard-carrying suburban busybody. He was a federal emergency coordinator, wearing government credentials around his neck and carrying a folder labeled USDA Agricultural Viability, Emergency Response. His partner wore FEMA blues and didn't smile much. They weren't there to make small talk. They were there because of the disaster Linda's HOA had just created. It turns out FEMA had been watching the trends, crop shortages, water rationing, fuel distribution, and it already started tagging properties like mine as critical local assets. The paperwork was already in motion by the time Linda sent bulldozers through my irrigation lines. What her HOA called an unsightly backyard garden was, in federal terms, infrastructure for food security, and destroying it during an active federal emergency? Well, that was a problem. A big one. What we're looking at, the FEMA man said, flipping through his paperwork, is a direct obstruction of emergency food supply during a declared crisis. Potential violation of multiple federal statutes. Your crops were registered. This isn't just civil anymore. He walked the field with me, noting the damage. Fences flattened. Rows of corn shredded down to mud. My irrigation pump half buried under a heap of bulldozed dirt. His partner took photos, documented everything, measured the footprint of the destruction. By the time they were done, Linda's name was written down in more government notebooks than she could possibly imagine. I could have left it there. Let the feds handle it. Let FEMA make their calls and the lawyers sort out in court. But I knew people like Linda. HOA presidents don't back down because of paperwork. They double down. They gossip. They manipulate. They gather their little boardroom armies and try to spin the narrative before the truth has time to settle in. So I decided to make sure the truth settled in fast. I called a meeting, not with the HOA, with the neighborhood itself. I printed flyers. I knocked on doors. I explained to every confused neighbor exactly what had happened. The bulldozers, the destroyed crops, the FEMA visit. I explained how their HOA president had just put their entire neighborhood on the federal government's radar. And not in a good way. People listened. Some laughed at first. Linda? No way she'd do something like that. But then I showed them the photos. The permit she'd faked. The footage from my security cameras. I showed them the FEMA report. That's when the laughter stopped. Turns out, not everyone loved Linda's reign of HOA terror. Behind closed doors, people started opening up. Stories of petty fines, of harassment, of property lines quietly moved under cover of darkness. One man showed me a letter where Linda threatened to sue over his choice of garden gnomes. Another family said she tried to block them from installing solar panels because they clashed with the neighborhood aesthetic. Linda wasn't just a nuisance. She was a powder keg waiting to blow. And now, thanks to her bulldozers, she dragged her entire neighborhood into the blast radius. I compiled statements. I gathered signatures. I built a file thicker than a phone book, not just for my lawsuit, but for the county, for FEMA, for the press, if it came to that. Because while Linda thought she could bulldoze her problems away, I knew something she didn't. Public pressure burns faster than paperwork. The next HOA meeting was standing room only. Neighbors who hadn't set foot in a community hall in years showed up, arms crossed, waiting for answers. Linda sat at her little folding table with her vice president and treasurer flanking her like nervous guards. The look on her face when she saw the FEMA agent sitting quietly in the back row? Priceless. I didn't shout, didn't grandstand. I stood up calmly, handed copies of my evidence to every board member, and stated, for the record, that my property had been destroyed without cause, that my rights had been violated, and that a federal investigation was now underway. Linda tried to speak, to spin it. We believed we had the right to... But people cut her off this time. Her own neighbors. You didn't. One man said flatly. You lied. Another woman added. You're putting all of us at risk. Someone else called out from the back. The room turned on her faster than I expected. Years of bottled frustration pouring out. Stories of overreach, of fines for ridiculous things, of being watched and judged and threatened for minor, petty infractions. People who've been too scared or too tired to fight back finally found their moment. And Linda, for the first time, she had no comeback. That night, the HOA board held an emergency vote, not about my crops, about her, a motion of no confidence, immediate suspension pending legal review. The vice president took her gavel. Security escorted her from the building. The neighbors applauded. It felt good, but it wasn't over, because FEMA wasn't just there to watch a neighborhood drama unfold. They had paperwork to file, recommendations to make, legal consequences to enforce. And as I shook hands with the agent on his way out, he left me with one final piece of advice. You should prepare. This is going to get bigger before it's done. Once Linda was suspended, you might think that would be the end of it. The HOA would tuck its tail between its legs, issue some half-hearted apology, and quietly retreat from my land. But you don't really understand people like Linda or HOAs in general until you've been on the receiving end of their paranoia. They're like hornets. Swat one, and the rest just get angrier. What I didn't fully realize yet was how deep Linda's claws had sunk into this neighborhood. Sure, the board had suspended her, but she still had friends, loyalists, people who thrived under her petty reign. The kind of people who liked writing anonymous complaints and peeking through curtains at 2 a.m. Even after she was removed, they kept stirring the pot. I started getting letters, not from the HOA directly. Those had stopped, but from individuals, neighbors, mostly anonymous, claiming I was now a dangerous presence, that my farm was creating undue attention, that I was provoking unnecessary federal involvement. Some even hinted that I brought FEMA down on purpose, as if I had the power to summon the government with a phone call. It was laughable and desperate, but it also told me something important. They were scared, and scared people make mistakes. So I leaned in. I doubled down on my documentation. Everything that happened from that point forward went into a file. Photographs, timestamps, witness statements. I installed additional cameras, ones visible from the street. Every neighbor who drove past my property knew they were on film. Every contractor, every lawn care worker, every teenage prankster. I wasn't hiding it. I wanted them to see, to know. And behind the scenes, I wasn't just sitting on my hands. I'd hired a lawyer, one with experience in both property rights and federal statutes related to agricultural protections. Together, we mapped out a strategy that went beyond simple lawsuits. We went after the HOA's insurance, the very policy that protected them from liability. It didn't cover illegal actions. Bulldozing land they didn't own fell squarely into that category. The moment my attorney sent a demand letter to their underwriter, things shifted. See, HOA boards love to act tough, but insurance companies, they hate exposure, they hate claims, and they really, really hate federal attention. Suddenly, board members who'd been silent started reaching out, not to apologize, to distance themselves. We had no idea Linda was acting independently. We never authorized heavy equipment. We're cooperating fully with FEMA. They weren't just covering their HOA, they were covering themselves. And every email, every voicemail, every desperate attempt to absolve responsibility went straight into my file. Meanwhile, FEMA wasn't letting up. They returned, this time with county officials and state agricultural inspectors in tow. They measured soil damage, calculated crop loss, assessed environmental impact. What had started as neighborhood pettiness was now officially classified as interference with a designated emergency resource. And with that classification came federal funding, a recovery grant, repairs, soil restoration services. FEMA even offered to fast-track infrastructure improvements, better fencing, enhanced irrigation, security upgrades. All free, all funded, all documented. Linda's little power play had officially made me a priority recovery site. But I wasn't done, because as satisfying as federal intervention was, I wanted something more lasting, something that would prevent this kind of abuse from ever happening again. So I went public. I contacted local news stations, framed it not as a personal feud, but as a cautionary tale. When HOAs overreach, how one neighborhood tried to bulldoze a family's future. I gave interviews standing next to my destroyed crops, pointed at the FEMA tents, showed the letters, the footage, the community outrage. I didn't name names outright, legal advice, but everyone in that town knew exactly who Linda from the HOA was. The story spread, from local outlets to regional news, from there to online forums, agricultural blogs, even HOA watchdog groups. Suddenly, my quiet little field wasn't just a neighborhood dispute. It was a symbol. Neighbors started coming forward from other developments. Horror stories of similar abuses. HOA fines for growing vegetables. Restrictions on rain barrels. Bans on backyard chickens. My inbox filled with messages from people saying, I thought I was alone. The county supervisor caught wind. Scheduled meetings. Promised reviews of zoning laws. Discussions about reining in overzealous HOAs, protecting urban agriculture, strengthening property rights. And through it all, Linda stayed silent, at least publicly. Behind the scenes, she was scrambling. I heard through the grapevine she'd lawyered up, trying to figure out how to minimize her exposure. Rumor had it she'd even tried to sell her house. Not easy when your name's attached to a federal investigation. And then came the final blow. A formal notice, delivered by courier, FEMA's legal department. Not just damages, penalties, financial liability for obstruction of emergency resources, assessed directly against the HOA and, pending legal confirmation, against any board members complicit in the action. Linda's name was highlighted in bold. Her friends stopped speaking up after that. At this point, I had what I wanted. My land restored, my crops protected, my name cleared, my story heard. But something bigger had happened along the way. The neighborhood wasn't the same anymore. People were talking, organizing, questioning the authority they'd blindly followed for years. And as I stood at the edge of my field one evening, watching the new irrigation system click on, I realized something else. I hadn't just won against Linda. I'd beaten the system she represented. And the message was clear. For this neighborhood, for others watching from the sidelines, for anyone who'd ever been steamrolled by petty power, we're done being bulldozed. By the time the county held its emergency public forum, the story had outgrown our neighborhood. This wasn't just about Linda anymore. It wasn't just about my bulldozed crops or the HOA's reckless stupidity. It had become a symbol of something bigger. Ordinary people finally standing up against unchecked, petty power. The auditorium was packed. Cameras lined the walls. Local news anchors, bloggers, even a few national outlets were there with notebooks in hand. On stage sat a panel of county supervisors, FEMA officials, state agriculture reps, and, flanked by her increasingly nervous attorney, Linda herself. She looked smaller than usual. Not physically, just diminished, like the weight of everything was finally sinking in. Her visor was gone. Her clipboard nowhere in sight. She wore the strained smile of someone who'd lost every battle, but still clung to the hope of a negotiated retreat. That wasn't going to happen. The FEMA representative spoke first. Calm, authoritative, and devastatingly clear. He outlined the laws violated, the damages incurred, the federal resources wasted cleaning up a mess that never should have happened. He named the HOA specifically. He named Linda specifically. Words like malfeasance, willful destruction, and obstruction of emergency preparedness echoed off the walls. Next came the county. Their speaker didn't hold back either. They cited the flood of complaints from my neighbors, the documentation of years of overreach, the impact on property values, and the community trust shattered by Linda's reign of terror. They introduced a motion to strip our HOA of its governing status pending full legal review. Applause broke out. Not polite, not hesitant. Real, cathartic applause from people who had waited too long to see justice catch up to this woman. And then it was my turn. I kept it simple. I told my story again, from the first trespass to the bulldozers, to the FEMA knock on my door. I held up the photos of my destroyed crops, the ruined irrigation lines, the footage of the machines tearing through land they had no right to touch. I pointed at Linda, not with anger, but with clarity. This wasn't about beautification. It wasn't about community standards. It was about control, about someone deciding their authority mattered more than the people they were supposed to serve. If this can happen here, it can happen anywhere. I finished by handing over a flash drive, every email, every recorded interaction, every legal document neatly organized for the county's records. I didn't need to say more. The evidence spoke louder than I ever could. What happened next wasn't dramatic, not in the movie sense. There was no shouting match, no last-ditch confession, just a unanimous vote by the county supervisors. Effective immediately, our HOA's powers were suspended. Linda was barred from holding any position of authority in any homeowners association within the state. Civil and potentially criminal charges were referred to the district attorney's office. And just like that, the gavel came down. Years of tyranny ended with a simple, final thud of wood on wood. But the revenge? That kept rolling. First, the lawsuits. My attorney moved fast, filing for damages that went beyond crop loss. Emotional distress, legal fees, lost income, punitive damages for the blatant violation of property rights. Linda's insurance carrier bailed immediately, citing exclusion clauses that left her and a handful of her former board members personally liable. Second, the liens. As judgments rolled in, liens were placed on Linda's property. Her pristine suburban home, the one she lorded over the neighborhood from like a petty queen, was now legally shackled. She couldn't sell it, couldn't refinance, could barely make repairs without court approval. Third, the community response. Freed from the shadow of HOA oppression, neighbors started tearing down the ridiculous restrictions Linda had enforced for years. Flags went up, gardens expanded, solar panels installed without a second thought. The neighborhood bloomed, both literally and metaphorically. People who'd once whispered their frustrations now laughed openly about the downfall of their former tormentor. Linda's friends stopped defending her. Some sold their homes and moved, unwilling to face the daily reminder of their complicity. Those who stayed adapted quickly to new reality. One without clipboards, without petty fines, without fear. And my land? FEMA came through. Grants paid for new equipment, better infrastructure, even expanded my fields. What had been a modest personal garden grew into a recognized agricultural asset for the county's emergency preparedness program. I employed local workers, donated surplus to food banks, hosted tours for schools teaching kids about sustainability and self-reliance. My destroyed crops became the foundation of something stronger, something enduring, a legacy, not just a victory. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Linda tried to disappear after that. I heard she moved in with a relative 2 towns over, somewhere with no HOA to command. She tried to sell her house once the liens were cleared, years later, after paying out every penny the courts demanded. But the stigma followed her. People remembered. Google remembered. Her name was forever tied to the story of the HOA president who bulldozed a field during a federal emergency and paid the price. I never saw her again. Didn't need to. I'd already won. But the best revenge? That came quietly on a sunny afternoon months later. I stood at the edge of my newly restored field, watching rows of crops sway under blue skies. irrigation humming steadily in the background. A FEMA vehicle drove past, the agent from before giving a small wave as they checked on another site down the road. And behind me, my neighbors. Families planting, kids playing, people free to live their lives without fear of citations for the color of their porch lights. I smiled, because in the end, Linda hadn't just lost her power. She'd lost her relevance, her grip on the neighborhood broken, her influence erased, her name a cautionary tale whispered over backyard fences. And me? I got my land, my peace, and something better. Proof that no one, not even the worst HOA Karen, can bulldoze your future if you stand your ground. Linda's reign was over, and the HOA was nothing but a faded memory of power gone wrong. You would think that's where this story ends, with justice served, property restored, and neighbors free from fear. But life has a way of adding a final, ironic twist. A reminder that some endings aren't just satisfying. They're poetic. 6 months after the county stripped the HOA's powers, I receive an unexpected letter. Not from a lawyer, not from FEMA, but from the State Agriculture Department. Apparently, my case had sparked more than local headlines. It had caught the attention of legislators looking for real-life examples of how overreach can harm sustainability efforts. In short, they wanted me to speak, at a public hearing, before lawmakers, about how suburban power trips nearly destroyed something essential, food security. I wasn't a politician. I wasn't an activist. I was a guy who liked planting crops, minding his land, and being left alone. But standing up there, telling my story again, this time to people who could change laws, felt like closing a circle. I showed them the photos, before and after. I explained how FEMA's involvement had saved more than just my fields, how communities like mine needed protection from petty bureaucrats disguised as concerned citizens. What I didn't expect, applause, and a promise. Within months, new legislation passed, stricter boundaries for HOAs interfering with agricultural land, stronger protections for homeowners growing their own food, clearer definitions of emergency resource exemptions. They called it the Urban Agriculture Protection Act. Locals just called it Linda's Law. Linda's name, forever tied to her own downfall. The neighborhood, freed from her grip, transformed fast. Where there had once been silent compliance, there was now collaboration. Community gardens replaced manicured hedges. Rain barrels lined driveways without fear fines. Neighbors who barely nodded before now swapped seeds, recipes, stories. The fences between us, literal and figurative, came down. Funny, isn't it? Linda tried to control us through rules. In the end, she united us through her failure. As for Linda herself, the last update I heard came from a former board member turned friend. She'd been spotted working part-time at a garden center in the next county over. Irony, again, selling mulch and tomato plants to people living the life she once tried to destroy. Word was, she kept her head down. No more clipboards. No more power trips. Just a name tag and a manager watching her every move. I never felt the need to confront her. She knew. Everyone knew. But one day, as I was walking through that same garden center, picking up supplies for the expanded plots FEMA helped fund, I thought I recognized her in the distance. Same posture, same tight-lipped expression. She didn't see me. Or maybe she pretended not to. Either way, I smiled and kept walking, because revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. It's living well while the people who try to ruin you have to watch from the sidelines, powerless to stop it. Back home, my fields flourished. New rows of vegetables sprouted where the bulldozers once ripped through. Local schools visited on field trips. News crews occasionally returned for follow-ups. The farm that beat the HOA. My story became a staple on HOA horror story forums, a cautionary tale shared between neighbors with their own Karens to battle. And the irony kept coming. One of the last things FEMA approved under my grant, a permanent sign. A big wooden one at the edge of my land, facing the street where Linda used to drive by daily. Community Emergency Resource Site. Official, permanent, protected. But beneath that, in smaller letters I paid for myself. No trespassing. No HOAs allowed. Neighbors laughed. Some took photos. Even the county officials gave a nod of approval. It wasn't just a rule anymore. It was a victory marker. In the years that followed, my farm became more than a home. It became a hub, a place where people gathered, not just to grow food, but to grow community, where kids learned that tomatoes didn't come from grocery store shelves, and adults remember what neighborly respect looked like without fear of a violation notice. And whenever a new face moved into the neighborhood, someone would inevitably point toward my land and say, "That's the guy who stood up to HOA. That's why we can plant what we want now." It wasn't about fame. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about legacy. Linda's legacy was fear, control, and destruction. Mine was resilience, growth, and freedom. And in the end, that's the real victory. Not just beating the HOA, not just outlasting Linda, but planting something lasting, watching it grow, and knowing that no bulldozer, no clipboard, no petty tyrant could ever uproot it again. Because when you stand your ground, you don't just protect your land, you change the landscape for good.